All right, so Freud is more well known for his focus on sex, and that sex is the kind of driving thing within all people. We're going to put that off to the side when we have this conversation about id-ego and superego. We want to understand them as stages of development of the human mind. And so id is the first stage that develops within us. It's the almost instant stage. Your id is defined by what we call the pleasure principle. I want it, and I want it now. When we think of id, often people will associate babies with id. You know, if a baby is hungry, it will cry, and it will cry until you satisfy it. Once it's satisfied, it shuts up. And so that's where you see, parents having to kind of problem solve. Are you hungry? Nope, you're still crying. Do I need to change a diaper? Nope, must be something else. Our id is eventually kind of balanced by our ego. When we say ego, we are not talking about our kind of ideal of self that develops, not like someone who's ego-driven or egocentric. This is a totally different concept. So where this is all about pleasure, your ego is all about reality. So if we stick with that ideal of hunger, your id goes, I'm hungry, I want to eat. Your ego starts to go, now's not a good time, hold on a little bit. You notice that young children, by about 7, we start to really kick in this concept of ego. Think about even bathroom things. We see that checked. It is not until you get to be roughly the age that most of you are at right now, before we see the superego really become a developed sense of self. Where these are more, internally based and learned, this is an external construct. So your superego is all about values. These are the things that you learn from your community, your society, things that are completely exterior. And so Freud sees this as a teeter-totter. So if we stick with our idea of, hey, I'm hungry, your id is screaming, hey, feed me, I'm hungry right now. Your ego is going, dude, it's 9:30, like lunch is at noon, you're okay, hold off a little bit. Your superego goes, there's starving children in Africa that haven't eaten in days. You know that you're a better person than to just want to eat crap all the time. Your superego, all those things that are learned and kind of instilled, and they counterbalance that id. If the id is all about pleasure, this is all about not necessarily the denial of it, but what's right and wrong. And so Freud eventually took this in the sexual realm, obviously in a very clear direction. We're going to hold back. Think about how this kind of ideal can apply to what we are looking at here with Heart of Darkness. Who in the book most closely represents id? Kurtz. Absolutely. We see him focus on what he wants when he wants it. It's that definite bit. How about ego? Marlowe. And we saw that yesterday. As Marlowe struggles with Kurtz, he says, I don't have anything to appeal to him with, but all he can do is to talk about the realities of the situation. And he doesn't have anything to appeal to him with because what we notice is that the superego is absent. Marlowe has introduced this because he says that these things can only happen when he's in the jungle, in that solitude, in that silence where darkness can get at you because there is no society to tell you no. It is why Kurtz came back down the river on that canoe trip. As he returns and sees the possible punishment of society, he knows, I want to deal with it, and scoots his butt back to the jungle. And so we are going to see how he's going to play with these ideas both today and tomorrow, but they're good to think about, especially in light of the fact that this is Marlowe's story. And so what he's seeing is someone who didn't have the inborn strength to fight that desire. And he's wondering if he does have it. Then we also have Jung's side of the story. So Jung and Freud had a huge fissure in the psychology world because Freud was so focused on sex and Jung just wasn't. Jung defined a couple of basic things. One of them is the concept of the other. Now, the article didn't necessarily talk about this, but when we say other, it is the recognition of what you are not. So if I am me, you are other. And so it's a very broad kind of concept that we can apply, and it's more specifically put down with this shadow self that he talks about and is talked about here in this article. It's the representation of those negative things, those pieces that you know are wrong and they're oppositional to how you feel. And we're going to see that, he's already done it once or twice to refer to Kurtz as shadow. It's going to continue today, and it's really this recognition of what Kurtz has turned into. We called him a shade and a wraith. And here shadow kind of continues that ideal of him being like a ghost, a empty former aspect of himself. We also have to realize that all of this comes after Conrad writes the novel. These guys may be thinking in these realms as Conrad's writing, but they haven't put a lot of their stuff to practice, and they haven't put it to words. So Conrad is sort of engaging ideas that are sort of there, but not necessarily. Here on 62, where we're going to pick up, we see the beginning of that darkness as they leave the station. And I always like to talk about this simple question. As the steamer boat goes to leave, all the natives come out and they're all chanting and making noise and doing things. And Marlowe simply just turns around and asks a basic question. Hey, do you understand any of this? Basic. Like, hey, you've been living here all this time. What the heck are these people doing? But it's Kurtz's answer that is most startling here. He says, do I not? And all of a sudden, we're able to bring in kind of the connotations of that phrase, where he's saying, of course I understand what it is. He's, I'm their God. You're taking me away from them. I also understand what I've done here. How can I not understand that? I've corrupted all of this. I've turned this into something much more. I'm there. There's a dark quality to that answer that has a lot of layers to it. And it's going to be further explored here as we get into the text. So we're going to start here on 62 after the break. We're going to go over to 64 for this first section. And at the bottom of the page, you notice that there's the sentence that ends a paragraph. It says, but I am, of course, aware that next day the pilgrims buried something in a muddy hole. We are going to see Marlowe start back on this course towards Europe and very quickly kill Kurtz. And so you will see Kurtz's death here in these next 2 pages. We will talk about sort of how he goes out and the meaning, and what we should get out of it in a moment. So take a couple of minutes, read those first 2 pages, and then we'll discuss. Good. Yes. Good. Okay, so we begin by talking about the fact that Marlowe is now out of favor with the others on the boat. This includes the manager and any other Europeans. Of course, to them, he has sided with Kurtz. He can't be trusted. Marlowe talks in general about this voice of Kurtz. He's finally given the gift he has been waiting for. Kurtz talks about my intended in my station, and you're going, this goes back to that long paragraph, to that way that Kurtz thought that everything belonged to him. Yes, we are fulfilling our foreshadowing from book 2. He mentions specifically the shade of the original Kurtz frequented the bedside of the hollow sham. So we bring up this shade concept. Like we said, shadow self. But we also reiterate this hollowness. And we've talked about it with these Europeans, that they seem to have these ideals up front that really are empty and unfulfilled. And this hollowness is a very important part of where he wants to go. Kurtz hands him a packet of documents and pictures, and he says, hey, keep this for me. This is that reputation. Marlowe promised the Russian, I will protect his reputation. He told Kurtz, hey, your reputation is safe with me, or your success in Europe is assured. This is the moment that he's past that thing that's going to become an issue, this group of papers. This includes the report that he hasn't read yet, but will. He talks about how Kurtz is this impenetrable darkness, and Marlowe feels as though he's on a precipice looking down at this pit, and Kurtz is so far into the pit he can't even see him. He's going to return to this metaphor of Marlowe standing on this precipice of darkness in a moment. We then get to Kurtz's death. He says he walks into the room and Kurtz is like, I'm waiting in the dark to die. And he's like, there's a candle right next to him. It's more to reinforce what Kurtz is going through. Marlowe says he looks at him and it looks as though he is reliving his whole life in this moment. And it all is summed up in this phrase, the horror, the horror. It's going to be important. What do you think the horror could be as he's reliving this and thinking about all these things before he dies? What could the horror be?
What he caused?
Yeah, let's start with the horror that he caused. I mean, this is a man who has set himself up as a god, who has taken offerings from the natives. And we know this is not who he was when he started out. And so imagine if you're having to relive your life and the choices that you've made and realizing, oh my God, what else could the horror be here? Yeah, it could be the horror of not being able to continue. Maybe, rather than we want this to be something where it's like reflective and he realizes the bad he's caused, but maybe to him the horror is, I didn't get to fulfill it. They took me out too soon. Anybody have a different read? I think given the context of the book, a popular read is to say that this is him talking about imperialism. If Conrad wants to demonize imperialism through the book as a whole, this reflection on the horror is more than just about him, but about this structure that allows him to do this, and to be this way. And of course, after hearing this pronouncement, Marlowe leaves. We have the simple, straightforward bit that's brought by the manager's boy that Kurtz is dead. And that's it. This great man that we've heard so much about through this whole book. We really only hear him speak a few times. We encounter him very briefly, and his death is almost a non-issue. Just sort of dies. And even he points it out at the end there. We bury him in a muddy hole, like it wasn't him anymore. Even in death, I didn't rush into the room because you know what? The voice was gone. It's just a thing. Marlowe is now going to, in the next paragraph, believe it or not, go all the way back to Europe. It's a simple plot device by Conrad to get him out. He doesn't care about the return trip. The return trip isn't important. And so he's literally going to have Marlowe get sick and not know how he gets back to Europe. He's just like, I'm sick. And in this paragraph, he's going to reflect on sort of his own starting to struggle with this darkness and talk about it. We're going to go all the way to, where should we go? Let's go to 67. We can knock this. We're going to go all the way to the bottom of the page. So the paragraph ends, I don't know, I can't tell, but I went. This is going to set us up for that final encounter that he is going to have tomorrow with Kurtz's intended. This is the last scene of the book where Marlowe will meet with her. And so he's going to, in this next chunk of text, you're going to see it's presented in big chunks, go from Africa to Europe. Then when he's back in Europe, he is going to have that packet of papers, Kurtz's reputation. He's going to talk about who shows up to try to collect this. And so we'll kind of talk through who shows up and what we should understand about this and what we walk away with. So read that next section. I'll make some notes here on the board, and then we should be able to come together before we leave. One more time. Good. All right, so to kind of put the book in and set us up for tomorrow with where we're going, you know, he has that paragraph after Kurtz dies where he talks about this idea of like remaining loyal to Kurtz. And the key parts, he introduces again this idea of him standing on like this precipice, this forward-facing part, and Kurtz being totally in the darkness. And he says what he sort of looks at is this fact that Kurtz had something to say. And he says, you know, the most you can hope for in this situation is to learn something about yourself and be able to express it. And we've seen he can't. He struggles with expressing these deeper pieces. And it's why when the book trudges into those moments of talking about experience, the text falls apart. In book one, Marlowe kind of loses it when he tries to express to them this concept of lying and how it broke his moral code. And he ends up with that phrase, we live as we dream alone. Because he goes, I can't get you guys to understand this. We see it again in book two after the death of the helmsman, where he struggles to put to words why the loss of Kurtz was significant. And here he's doing it again, because in his mind, Kurtz was able to go full in. And he was able to express it, which makes him this exceptional being. And he's like, I put my foot over into the darkness and I retreated. I was given that chance to come back, but I still can't put it to words. And he even says at one point, you know, when he comes back, he feels like he wants to enlighten people. But Marlowe is himself without enlightenment. We know that from the beginning of the book, that image of him as the Buddha without the lotus. He hasn't figured this out yet. And we still don't quite know all the pieces. We'll see them by tomorrow for what he's struggling with at his core. But as he comes back, he says, he sees that change, and he's expressed that to some degree. When he fell apart in book two, and he talks about people in Europe kind of walking delicately between the butcher and the policeman. Imagine for him that you come back from Africa and you've seen the things that you have, and then you're put back into normal life. And you watch people just go through their normal day-to-day, and he says, I just want to laugh at them because they're so silly. We see today, not to kind of compare Marlowe in the same way to this, but we better understand the concept of PTSD through our veterans and the experiences that they have. And that when they come back, they have a very hard time reacclimating to normal life when they've been in these very affecting situations. And so I think there's definitely that conversation that can be had about Marlowe's reaction being kind of driven by that same ideal. He talks about the people that do show up inquiring about Kurtz and what he brings back, and he names three. The first is a clear company man that shows up. He wants this stuff because of the business end, and Marlowe kind of stonewalls him and says, there is nothing about business here. This is all personal stuff, and the only thing he offers him is the report. But he makes sure to take off the postscript. And so when Marlowe has said, hey, guess what? Kurtz's reputation is safe with me. Only thing that would show that Kurtz put this into action is that postscript. But Marlowe's decision to take it off has started that process of preserving the reputation of Kurtz. And the question you should be asking is this a lie? Marlowe has said he's going to bury the ghost of Kurtz's gifts with a lie. Is this it? Then the second person that shows up is Kurtz's cousin. Yeah, right. Like if you think this is Kurtz's cousin, you're totally off. Notice that everything he says about Kurtz, Marlowe's like, I didn't know he was a musician. I didn't know this. He's like, I guess he could be. But if the company shows up the first time and you tell them, hey, all we have is personal letters, and then magically the next person to show up is a cousin. The third person that shows up is a reporter. He talks about how Kurtz could be a leader of men, and you're like, that's kind of funny. He takes the report. And now we're left with all that remains. Kurtz's memory, his intended. Tomorrow we're going to put these two things together in this final scene as Marlowe comes to meet this woman that meant something to the original Kurtz. We find out what's really bugging him when we put the pin in this book. So be thinking about questions that you have about the book, things that don't seem to make sense to you, because our conversation Thursday will be kind of driven by what are you noticing? What do we need to clarify for you? So yeah, if you'll